now that you learned how to position your grid items inside the grid container by giving them a certain number of cells, you're now ready to learn how to align those grid items inside the container. So you will learn how to align them vertically or horizontally. So you will learn first how to align individual grid items inside your container. Then you will learn also how to align the whole content of the grid inside the container. So first of all, I'm going to make a few changes to our current design. So I'm going to go to the container and make it occupy the full height of the web page by giving it a height property set to 100 VH. So this will make sure it spans over the full height of the web page. Then I'm going to change the height of the rows to 110 pixels. I'm going to keep the columns as they are at the moment. And also I'm going to keep only 6 or 7 items inside the grid. So this is how our grid looks like at the moment. Now let's learn how vertical alignment works. This means that you're going to be aligning your grid items vertically inside their corresponding rows. Now, to see this clearly, the grid items would need to have different heights. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the different grid items and change their height. So first of all, I'm going to give them an ID. Or instead, let's give them a class, since we've got some items appearing twice. So now I can select the elements using their class and change their height. So let's go to Apple and set its height, for example, to 100 pixels. Then let's go to Microsoft or Facebook and go for 50 pixels. Then let's go to Microsoft and go for 70, for example. Let's give Samsung a height of 80 pixels. And let's give Google a height of 40 pixels, for example. And also let's give Amazon a height of 35. So now, as you can see, the different grid items have different heights. So aligning the grid items vertically will have a clear effect because they have different heights. So how do we do this? So just like Flexbox, the alignment properties are attached to the container of the grid items. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to the container and set the properties right there. So here I'm going to align items vertically inside their row. So the property you would need to use here is called align items. So this property is going to align your items inside their row. So for example, if I set this to center, then my items are going to be centered vertically inside each row. So that's the first row, and you can see how the items are aligned centrally. And that's the second row, and you can see also how they are aligned vertically. All right. Now there are other values you can use for the align items property. So you can use start, for example, and Here they're going to be pushed to the top of each row. You can go for and here they're going to be pushed to the bottom of the row. You can also use the stretch property, and this is the default value, but it's not going to work here because we set the height of each of our grid items. Otherwise, the grid items would have stretched vertically inside their rows. All right. There is another value you can use. It's the baseline, just like the one you use in Flexbox. And here they're going to be aligned based on their baseline. So let's keep this aligned to center. And let's move to the next step, which is to align our items horizontally inside their columns. So instead of aligning them vertically, I'm going to align them now horizontally inside the columns. So the property you need to use here is called justify items. So if I set this to center, for example, then the items are going to be centered horizontally inside their columns. And you can see that the width of each grid item is going to be reduced to fit its content. So we only need the minimum width which is necessary to fit the content of the grid item. You can use other values like the stretch value, which is the default value. You can use start and they will be pushed to the left of the column. You can use and to push them to the right of each column. So let's keep this center for now. All right. So now you know how to align your grid items horizontally and vertically inside the rows and columns. Now there is a property called place items, which takes two values. The value that you would set the align items to and the value that you would set the justify items to. So if I set place items to center and center, then I don't need to set the align items and justify items, because this means that align items is set to center and justify items is set to center as well. So what place items does is that it sets the align items and the justify items. And just make sure that you remember the order. And the direction is vertical, then horizontal. All right. But if I change this to stretch, for example, then horizontally, my items are going to be stretched instead of centered. Now that you learned how to align your items inside the columns and rows, let's understand how to align the whole content of the grid inside the grid container. So what I'm going to do now is align the whole grid horizontally. So to do this, you use a property which is similar to justify items, but this time it's called justify content. So if I set this to center, then my content inside the grid will be centered horizontally. We can't see it clearly here. I'm going to change the styling of the grid so that we can see it in a better way. So I need to make sure the width of the content is less than the width of the container. So I'm going to change the dimensions of the columns. So for example, I'm going to go for 500 pixels. So now we end up with two columns and the width of the content is clearly less than the width of the container. And you can see that our content is centered inside the grid container once we set justify content to center. All right. Now, if you go to start, then you push the content to the left. If you go to end, then you push it to the right. So I'm going to keep it centered for now. And then I'm going to move to aligning the whole grid vertically. So just like the align items property, I'm going to use a property called align content. So if I set that to center, then my content is going to be centered vertically inside the grid container. Now, if I set that to start, then I'm going to push the whole content inside the grid to the top of the grid. And if I set that to end, then I'll push it to the bottom, as you can see. All right. So let's keep it centered for now. And just like the place items property, there is another property, place content, which will combine both the align content and the justify content. So just to make sure we keep this in the right order, I'm going to place this on top like that. And place content, if I set it to center and center, it means that I'm setting align content to center and I'm setting justify content to center. So it's always the vertical alignment, then the horizontal one. And by the way, many of the properties that I cover here, especially the place content and the place items, they are supported by modern web browsers. All right. So hopefully you are now comfortable aligning your grid items inside the grid container, and you can also align the whole content of the grid inside the container. In the next few videos, you're going to see a few examples of how to apply your knowledge in real-life examples before diving into a big project.